everyone. Hopefully you all had something delicious to eat. And now we are back at VMware Migration Day. And first up in our lightning demos this afternoon, we have Ken Crandall from Rackspace.
Thank you, Kendall. All right, so I don't know how many of you got to see the keynote yesterday, but I'm basically going to run through the same migration I did yesterday, but at a little bit higher level of detail. Actually doing it again live, but a little bit higher level of detail and a little bit more insights into kind of why some of the choices were made that I made. So to start us off, let's look at kind of what we're doing. So we're migrating a VM from our there's an alarm from our Chicago data center to essentially what's runs to Dallas, and that's because my VMware lab is running in our Chicago data center, and I migrated it to our OpenStack Flex public cloud, a U.S. central region in our Dallas, which is in our Dallas data center. Now, to give you an idea, this is about 5 states apart. If you do it by the quickest drive, it's about 1,400 kilometers. If you did it by, center to center of the cities, it's 1,500 kilometers. It's quite a distance. And we're not doing this over a private connection, right? When you're doing migrations inside a data center, you're probably going to set up a dedicated network that's not, having any traffic congestion or anything. We're doing this over the internet, so speeds may vary. So where we're starting out. Our lab is a vSphere 7 lab, and we chose this on purpose, right? vSphere 8's the newest and 9's just coming out, but the majority of the customers I've talked to who are looking to doing their migration had VMware 7 perpetual licenses, which are no longer perpetual. So that's probably 80% of the people that we're talking to doing migrations are on vSphere 7, and probably the remaining 20% are on vSphere 8. So we use vSphere 7. There's 3 SXI hosts, a vCenter, an NFS NAS shared storage, and everything's running on a distributed vSwitch. Now, a couple of things, like this is a demo, obviously, and this has been set up to be a little bit favorable to demo conditions, but also so stuff we like to actually practice in the field as well. So, for example, the target we're actually migrating this Open Infra Demo VM, which I'll show you a little bit more in a second. And we're migrating to our OpenStack Flex. Now, you'll notice in the names of the networks down there, it's Gateway Net and Gateway Subnet. Those were networks that I pre-created in the OpenStack Flex region that I'm deploying in the tenant I'm deploying to. And you actually gave it the same IP range as the private network in the vSphere network. Now, obviously you need to make sure, because if you're doing something, complicated or like a stretched layer 2, you have to be careful of MAC collisions and IP address collisions. But since in our case these are a private network, and this service is sitting beside a NATed IP in both sides, and we'll get to the actual application architecture in a second. But this, we can make our life easier a lot by having the same IP ranges on both sides, and by front-ending our application with a load balancer. And so what I did is I set up a traffic load balancer, and that's what the demo.rackslack.cloud IP address points to. And it can either point to 1 or 2 backends. I mean, you could do mirroring, you could do other things. It's a load balancer, but I'm using it basically to switch between A and B. And the first endpoint is the ORD or Chicago endpoint, and that's demo.ord.rackspace.cloud. So if you have a laptop, you can follow along. And if you hit demo.rackslack.cloud, you will actually see this, the video, same video we had in the demo. And if you hit demo.ord, you'll see the same thing, because this load balancer is pointing to our ORD endpoint. Now, the other endpoint in the Dallas-Fort Worth one will be named demo.dfw.rackspace.cloud. And it has its own public endpoint. And if you do it now, you're going to get a 404 because it doesn't exist yet. And so before we go any further, I'm actually going to start our migration, because it does take a little bit of time. All right, I'm going to set this down because typing one-handed is ugly. So this is our Coriolis dashboard. As I said yesterday, we're using a tool from one of our partners. Our partners is Cloudbase, and their tool is Coriolis. And you can see there's still remnants of my migration from yesterday still on here, but we're going to actually start a new transfer. And we're actually doing a migration. Coriolis has a lot of features, and since this isn't a Coriolis session, I won't go into all the neat stuff it can do. But one of the things it can do is it can replicate in addition to just migrating. But we're actually going to do a migration. We're migrating from VMware. And now and I set up these endpoints earlier, so it's got all my endpoint credentials from both sides. Now on the VMware side, you do have to have administrative credentials. And so I'm doing from VMware 7, and we're going to just do that. And then on there, it's basically contacting my vSphere instance and coming up with what are the instances running on here. We're going to migrate the OpenInfra demo. Now our target is OpenStack Flex, OpenStack Flex DFW region. It now goes through and interrogates my OpenStack cloud the same way. Now I've set up a couple things advanced. One is something that Coriolis calls a minion pool, which is a set of VMs that actually are kind of helper VMs that do the work in the target field. We're going to pick a flavor for actually do the migration, and I'm going to use a big honking one because it tends to go a little bit faster. Not that big. And we're going to run it on Windows on a Ubuntu 24.04, and then I actually have this set up running in a network. So if we go over here real quick to you can see here's the gateway subnet where things are, the load balancer is running there. There's a sample web server I've used to test things earlier. And eventually we'll see the OpenInfra demo VM show up there. There's this whole migration subnet in a different area. And there's a DNS name server. And there's other appliances and stuff as well in here that actually do our migrations. So we're going to use our migration network. We're migrating again from the gateway virtual port group on our distributed vSwitch to the gateway net that I set up. We're using performance storage backends, and we're going to get this thing. Oh, I forgot to do something. This is what happened to me yesterday. So there's one little thing I have to do is since we're doing a public thing, I have to set up a floating IP, and so I had to check. You have to check that one little checkbox there, and if you forget, it gives you a really esoteric feedback that took me a minute to figure out. So we're going to start and so after you set up the transfer, which is actually taking a snapshot of the source VM, transferring that over to your destination location, and then there's a deployment, which takes that snapshot, creates a new OpenStack VM, and does any changes necessary. And so I'm going to actually set up that deployment to happen automatically. This is an Alpine Linux VM, so we don't have to do really any OS morphing because it's set up to run in both environments pretty easily. And then we'll get it started. So migration successfully created. And now, like yesterday, you're going to see all these steps are kind of really nicely outlined in here. And that's one of the big reasons I chose Coriolis to do this demo, is we've worked with other tools, both open source and closed source tools. And a lot of them have a, very, I would say Unixy or Linuxy CLI output with a lot of log data, which is very useful for automation and very useful when you're doing things in mass, but not very pretty for a demo. And also a lot harder to explain what's going on because you're just seeing log stuff fly by. This kind of gives you that same experience because there's a lot of the same steps, but it's got a nice UI that kind of gives us how we are in this process. So while this is running, and I'm leaving this up here on purpose so we can see what's running, we'll go to a little more what's going to happen. So you can see this is what our architecture looks like. Where we're starting out, as I said, just the ORD VM and the load balancer, and it points to there. As I showed you, here's our load balancer. It's pointing to our ORD endpoint. And if I go to demo.ord, there it is. Demo.dw doesn't exist yet, so it's still going to load forever while it tries to figure out where that is. Then we're doing the migration with Coriolis now, and what it's doing is taking basically cloning that VM across the internet, again, across the public internet. And what's really interesting is I'm not using any administrator credentials on my OpenStack cloud. I'm using just the tenant. So one nice thing is if you are setting up, like some of the customers we've talked to who are doing VMware migrations actually have a lot of small VMware deployments that are done at the departmental level. And it was really interesting because you'd think they would have collapsed it all into a much larger, more effective deployment, but they haven't, because either through acquisitions or through just the way they've done IT traditionally, they've kind of operated independently. But as they've decided to move to OpenStack, one of the things they've took that opportunity to do was to re-architect their internal IT to a more centralized model. And again, it's still self-service, because cloud is by its nature self-service, but now it can be centralized. You get the economies of scale, you get the kind of provider, operator, tenant, isolation points. And so what's really fascinating to me is actually how often we run into that, because I think, this is modern IT, it should be like modern, and it's not. So pick up over here. Where's our transfer going? Yeah, now it's doing the hard part, which it's actually sending it over the internet, and it's about 20% done. So it's actually moving pretty quickly. Now that I said that, it will slow down. So once we migrate it over, both will be up, but we'll flip over the traffic load balancer, point to the DFW VM. And so you'll be able to, so when you hit demo.rackslab.cloud, you'll be actually hitting the DFW VM. And this one, and then what I'll do just at the end is shut down this VM so I can show you, so you'll be able to hit both kind of direct VM endpoints for a while, but I'll shut this one down so that basically as a proof point, when you hit demo, you're actually hitting the new one. Yeah, we're at 30% now. So now we're in the watching paint dry phase of this demo. So while we let this kind of continue on, does anyone have any questions while we kind of wait for this to kind of get to the next point where I can do stuff? Sure, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. So I'm just going to repeat it so that everyone hears what. I'm migrating a very small VM in this case. What happens when you're migrating VMs with a large amount of RAM or a large amount of virtual disk? Now, another thing I'm going to point out is that we're doing this VM kind of a live migration. When we're dealing with VMs, particularly larger VMs or at a massive scale, typically, as much as possible, we try and do cold migration. So we try and shut down the source VMs and migrate them over and bring them back up. So do it under the auspices of a maintenance window. And this is for two reasons. One is like when you're dealing with like large applications, and this is the same problem you run into if you're trying to vMotion that VM from site A to site B. By the time you've moved that much data, so much has changed, it will never catch up. And I remember the early days of vMotion back before we really had 10 gig or 25 gig networking side, east-west, you would frequently run into this problem with trying to move large VMs where it would basically give up and say, I'm never going to catch up. So the way we get around that is A, we try and do those cold if possible. B, we try and look and see are there other ways to move that type of because it really depends on what that operation is. Like a lot of times the big ones like that tend to be database servers, for example. And there tend to be multiple different ways to migrate database servers from point A to point B. Like for example, a lot of times you can take a snapshot, migrate that snapshot and move it over, which is the back-end mechanism of this anyway. But instead of immediately going live on the new one, you might be able to get the entire large thing migrated over. And yeah, there'll be some deltas on the front end, but then you set up your maintenance window and say, okay, at that point, because I have a snapshot, I have also a point in time, and I can generate playback logs from that point in time and replay them on the target. Other ones you have tools like, Oracle's got Golden Gate, MySQL, and PostgreSQL have their own, and some of the the NoSQL DBs have their own tools for data migration. But generally the pattern's the same, where you migrate a chunk of it, and this is again predicated on the fact that that you have this large corpus of data, but not a ton of it is going to change over that time. If you have basically a huge amount of data and it's going to completely rewrite itself on the time you migrate it, that's a whole different pattern to back up. But that's generally how we approach those types of things. And actually points out to another thing I want to mention is one of the most important things you can do for this is have a plan. A lot of customers we talked to, it was surprising to me, but they thought it was basically like, oh yeah, you're going to shut it down on Friday, migrate everything and turn it on Monday and be done. And I'm like, how much do you have? And like, and because the biggest constraint out of all this, honestly, is physics. It's like how fast can you move data from point A to point B, right? And it's not just networking, it's reading from disk, writing through disk. Like I said, I'm going over the internet here. If I'm doing this in a private data center, I might be able to set up like a really sweet, 100 gig backbone, 10 gig to the top of the rack, or 25 gig to the top of the rack network to do these VM migrations. But if I'm reading off spinning Rust, it's going to take the time it takes. So you have to kind of have a plan and understand what data you're migrating, what the dependencies are. We maybe break them up into migration groups and have different plans for migration groups, like databases or big servers. You may have other things that are clustered that sit behind load balancers like this, where instead of even migrating them, you stand up new stuff and you add those to the load balancers, and you take the old stuff out and you just migrate the service over. So there's different. Again, having that plan is the most important part, and then you just iterate on that plan. Like typically, what happens is our initial guess at timeline tends to be pretty conservative. And once we've gone through the first couple of move groups, we're like, okay, this part heads up a lot faster than we thought, so we can adjust our things. Or this is happening way slower than we thought. Or it takes forever for the network team to reassign IPs to our new pool, so we can migrate the data and then wait for 2 days while the network team does their thing. So I mean, you learn what all those little aspects of it are and readjust your plan. So it's really important to have a good plan, be communicating both with in our case, our customer, or with your management team if you're doing it internally, and just having everything kind of out in the open, right? Because this is a big leap of faith for a lot of people. Like they've decided, getting them to go from physical to virtualization was a big leap of faith, and now getting them to go from VMware to OpenStack, or from closed source to open source, or any other number of changes is a big leap of faith. And so the more you can keep out in the open, and the more you can be honest about, okay, here's the difficulty we ran into, here's what we know how to deal with it, here's how we overcame it, here's how we worked out the abilities to get in the rest of our plans about it, it's almost better to have one or two little blips that you get over in the beginning, and show that you're capable of doing this in a good way, that we're good. So now we've completed this part actually happens a lot quicker. It's completed our transfer. It's now detaching the transfer volume and the destination, and as soon as it's done, it just completed this, and now it started the next part, which is called the actual deployment. And this doesn't take nearly as long. Oh, there it is. It's kicking off the deployment, and this part is basically where it's taking this disk, it's taking that snapshot and creating a cinder volume from that, doing any necessary changes to attributes. So like if it's got to change IP addresses, if it's got to change the MAC address, it will do that. If it's got to, in the case of Windows, uninstall the VMware tools and install the QEMU guest tools. This is where that's what they call OS transformation or OS migration, or morphing, I think it's called in the INS tool. Everyone's got a slightly different name for it. But fundamentally, this is where all those changes happen. And then finally, once it's done with that, it picks a flavor, spins up a flavor, and it'll be active. And so this will take about a minute, and then we'll be able to finish the last bit, which is to assign our floating IP, flip over our load balancer, and then we'll be done. So any more questions while we're watching this part? Ask a hard question, come on. My favorite thing about OpenStack is that it's open source. My whole career has been based on open source, and so I really believe in the democratization of software. Like, it's not to say that people can't, and that's to say that people can't make money, because you have expertise, you have experience, you have services you can provide, but the gatekeeping of paying for licensing for software just seems silly, and it leads to a lot of duplication of effort by a lot of people. So I love open source for that reason. It's that hard question. Come on, kid. All right. So what are we doing? So we're waiting for Cinder to do its thing. How many of us have waited for Cinder to do its thing? Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, so like, there's kind of like what I'd say like the OG virtualization migration tool, which is V2V, and that was a tool created by Red Hat way back when. And basically, that automates some of the manual tools. Like I actually have done a manual migration where I literally pulled a VMDK out, converted it using QEMU image to a QCOW, uploaded that as a glance image, instantiated a VM from that, and then done all the necessary changes to the ending OS and done that. And like I said, like I've said before, the technical aspects of moving stuff over isn't that hard or complicated. You can be. I mean, you can have really crazy, hairy VMs that you're migrating over, or really interesting networking situations that people create for themselves. And yeah, there's always ways to make it challenging, but the transformation of data from a VMDK to a QCOW image or a RAW, uploading that into your data store, creating a VM from that, is all pretty much rote stuff that we all know how to do. It's doing it en masse, and it's doing it in a way. So Vert V2V is one. The Ansible tool that Sumaya showed yesterday that Red Hat did is very much a CLI-driven tool. I mean, she did it through basically Oracle, Red Hat's Ansible automation platform, but most of us run Ansible from the CLI, like myself. There's another tool, Migrate Kit, that is very CLI-driven. Most of the open source tools tend to be more CLI-driven, and I mean, that's kind of the world that this group tends to come from. So now what we're doing is it's creating the right instance, pick the flavor, start in the instance, and it should take a second and just show up. So great, it should show up really fast. So let's go to our compute. There's our open for demo. We'll assign it a floating IP, 201, okay. That's all going. So now if we go over to our demo.dfw, this bad boy should show up here in just a second as soon as everything is good to go. Let's see. Yep, there we go. There we go. So now we can see individually both sides are up. We'll now flip over our endpoint through my handy dandy little script. We'll validate that our endpoint is switched to DFW. We'll rehit the demo VM. There it's working. Now we'll go and actually shut down the old one. Oh yeah, there's all sorts of like beginning and ending. You can have it automatically assign floating IPs and stuff like that. I kept this pretty simple so I could control the paces, because like one of the nice things is you can actually batch migrate 10s or 20s or tranches of VMs at a time with Coriolis, and it's a really excellent tool. So now that you'll see that our ORD one should time out, so it's timing out, but our demo one is still going. So we did it.